Our scripture lesson for today comes from Exodus, the 17th chapter, verses 1 through 7. And this is what it says. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses, and they said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Today, I want to talk for a few minutes from the topic compassionate pragmatist. Compassionate pragmatist. Recently, my family and I encountered a situation with a major corporation that seemed unfair and unacceptable. I'm actually going to put that company on blast by saying it was Delta Airlines. We had planned a family vacation to Grand Cayman as one of my daughter's high school graduation gifts. I had booked and paid for the flights and had selected our comfort class seats. We did that months ahead of time so that we would make sure we had the seats together that we wanted. But then a few weeks ago, I happened to check my email and I saw I had an email from Delta, which was sent to inform us that they had moved us to a different flight, not a few minutes earlier or a few minutes later. They moved us to a flight a full day earlier than what I had purchased. And there was no satisfactory possibility to move us back to the original flight or the original day. There was no reason given why my family was chosen to be the people who had to give up our seats on the original flight. The agent I spoke to even confirmed that it was the same type of plane. And as you can imagine, I was livid. Ultimately, we had to cancel our whole trip. And of course, Delta received a very direct and impassioned letter of complaint from me. All of us have probably received some level of inferior service or disrespect that triggers us to complain. Most of the time, our complaints are warranted, but sometimes the issue is just a result of a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, and sometimes there is a reasonable explanation for the offending incident. Many of us might be familiar with the story that was read for today, the text, because it includes, among many things, a story about lodging a complaint. Many of us are familiar with the story of the Israelites' exodus from slavery in Egypt, how Moses was chosen by God to go tell Pharaoh to let God's people go. And after multiple unfavorable plagues, the people left. According to the story, they even crossed through the sea to step towards their promised land. Our text today finds the people in the wilderness with no water. And there was, if you're taking a whole lot of people out of captivity, there's no way to pack provisions for a mass of people to move into a wilderness. It says in the scriptures that the number of people was 600,000 men. Now that means if men in that time averaged 5 children apiece and a wife, That means that number would have been 6 million people. I have to say on the side that when we read these stories in the Bible, it's important not to take everything literally. By the time this story was written, it had passed through generations. And you know how stories can be conflated over time. How even in one room, if 10 or 12 people starts telling a message around the room, you know by the time it gets back to you, it's completely different. That's what some people say, historians say, happened in this story and in this case. Because according to history, if the Exodus really did happen, it only included a few thousand people, not 6 million people. So back to our scripture. When we read the Bible, it's important to approach what we're reading, listening for God's message to us, not facts from a 13th century BCE story. Actually, in this case, it would be facts from around 600 BCE, because that's when the story was written. It was talking about the 13th century BCE, but the story when it was written in the 1600s BCE. You know, it was written so that the Israelites would read this, would receive this message in exile in Babylon and Persia. The point was to give them hope, remind them what God had done in their past, what God had done for their ancestors. So then maybe deliverance would come for them from their contemporary pharaohs. You know, sometimes when we're in a crisis situation, being reminded how God moved in our past or in the past of our ancestors, or even in the lives of our friends, that will sometimes serve as a glimmer of hope that God would do the same thing for us. Usually, when this text is preached, it's communicated from the perspective that the Israelites did something wrong, that they were wrong for murmuring and complaining to Moses. It's usually communicated that the people tested God or had no faith. But today I want to look at this from a little bit different perspective. Imagine, just imagine for a minute, being in an uncultivated, uninhabited, and inhospitable environment. It's hot, there's nothing there. You have no idea how long you're going to be in that situation. You're tired from traveling from place to place, following a man with a vision and of freedom and a staff. There's no Four Seasons to stop by, not even a Motel 6. The people didn't have any place where they could stop for rest and refreshment. And here they are at a place where, forget about a bed, etc. They didn't even have any water. And you know, water is necessary for a healthy human life. 60% of our body weight is water. It's necessary to restore fluids lost through metabolism, sweating, and removal of waste. To be without water causes headaches, muscle and joint aches. You just feel kind of miserable, and it can ultimately lead to death. So it was not a frivolous desire. It was a necessity for life itself that triggered the questioning from these people. So when I look at this text, I don't see faithless people. I don't see bad people. I see people who exercised a reasonable amount of personal agency to speak up for themselves and for their needs. I see people who were in a bad situation and knew something had to be done. So what did they do? They went to the person who had already been the one who exhibited that he could communicate with and be a vessel for God in order to get God to act on the people's behalf. In the narrative, God had parted the sea. God knew when they needed food and sent quail and manna for them to eat. So it stands to reason that when the people got thirsty, they would go to Moses and have Moses approach God about the water situation like he did about everything else he was leading. I'll admit their complaints were a bit terse. Just going up to the man and saying, "Give us water to drink," or coming and saying, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst?" But a strong complaint is called for. Personal agency, the capacity of an individual to actively and independently choose and affect change. Agency demands that we sometimes need to speak up. Sometimes we need to complain. White people in the United States were not just sitting around eating pie and thinking about ending slavery in this country. It took Black people to start with speaking up for themselves and complaining about the dehumanizing treatment of dark-skinned people. When I used to speak and lobby for LGBTQ rights in Georgia and in Washington, D.C., people, there was a reason to talk to people. There was a reason to complain about injustice. There was a reason to speak up. There was a reason to demand change. People used to say I was just trying to justify my lifestyle. No, my lifestyle is I get up and go to work and I eat and, pay my mortgage, that kind of stuff. That's lifestyle. Who I am, that's something else. And that who I am deserves to be treated equally and deserves respect. So yeah, I was trying to speak up against injustice. That's how Black people gained the right to vote. That's what ended Jim Crow laws. That's what put an end to lynching. That's how women gained the right to vote and the right to have equal pay for equal work. It was because people complained, that people spoke up. People spoke up about what was wrong and what needed to be fixed. I remember how vocal and present Ahmaud Arbery's mother was as she demanded justice for this present day lynching of her son. She spoke up. She spoke up loudly, and she believed until the men responsible were convicted. It's Women's History Month, and I'm reminded of the many women who stood up for justice, who spoke up, who would have sounded like they were complaining, but they were complaining for justice. Like Fannie Barber Williams was an advocate for freeing slaves. She helped found organizations such as the National League of Colored Women and the National Association of Colored Women and the NAACP. Or women like Coretta Scott King, who was already an activist before marrying Martin Luther King Jr. and continued to be an activist after he died. Or Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights advocate who famously said she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. Many of us, if not all of us, have experienced something that has made us sick and tired. That's when it's time to speak up. My mentor when I was working on my doctorate was Professor Marcia Riggs. She wrote a book called Arise, Awake, and Act, A Womanist Call for Black Liberation. And I was so impressed in that book because of the people that she lifted up. She lifted up the fact that the 19th century club women's movement worked to reject oppressive images of African-American people and roles of African-American people, and challenged African-Americans to strive for communal liberation and social betterment. It's that kind of agency, the will to speak up for us and our communities, that makes things better for ourselves and for our children. These sort of changes call for us not only to complain, but also to do some work. In the text, Moses took the people's complaints and actually did take those complaints to God. But the thing is, in the story, it's a little different because Moses didn't do it for the people. Moses did it out of fear that the people were going to stone him, that something was going to go wrong if he didn't do something. But that's okay, because sometimes our agents of change may not really care about our condition, but they may just have the means to make something happen, so we complain anyway. As we read in the story, God hears the complaints as delivered by Moses and gives Moses directions on what to do to source some water for the people. That meant Moses had to do something seemingly nonsensical to make a difference. Hitting a rock doesn't sound like a good plan. But God made it clear that it was God who would work the miracle. God said, I will stand before you at the rock. Moses just needed to have faith enough to do what God was saying. And by following through, as we know in the story, there was water. Some people say this whole passage of scripture shows that the people didn't have faith. I don't see it that way, because just the act of complaining to Moses meant the people had faith enough to believe that something different, something positive could happen. In the case of all of those movements and change makers that I mentioned earlier on, they all had a hope that things could be better than what they were. Slaves maintained a vision of freedom against the odds. I believed that one day LGBTQ people would reach a level of equality. Black people believed that one day they would have the right to vote and one day lynching would end. The fuel that keeps some of us working and believing is the same thing that happened for the Israelites in the wilderness. We believe in a God that knows us and cares for us. And even when we're in a bad situation, even when we complain, God cares for us. Because a complaint is not a sign of our lack of faith. A complaint is a spark of possibility. And with God, all things are possible. It's possible for us. It's possible to have sensible gun laws. It's possible to end violence and wars. It's possible to fix what we've done to the climate. It's possible to do something to end poverty. It's possible to do something to enable healthcare for everybody. It's possible. We may have to complain to get there, but we complain and we do because it's possible. One of the many things I like about God is that God is what I call a compassionate pragmatist. God doesn't get caught up in all of our drama. In the text, we read that God didn't even respond to Moses' dramatic speaking about they're almost ready to stone me. God didn't say anything. God didn't say something against the people. God doesn't get caught up in what my wife calls our hoopla. The text says it was Moses, not God, who got caught up in it, because it was Moses, not God, who named the place where this event occurred, Massa and Meribah, which meant quarrel and testing. I think he did that because he got caught up in the drama and he was upset about what the people said and did to him. But even if the people did say, is the Lord among us or not? That's an honest response to the situation in which they found themselves. God was still their unoffended provider and constant companion. God doesn't get pushed away or take offense to us complaining, to whatever we do to reach out to God. We want to have a real relationship. And a real relationship, you get all of me. You get the complaining me. You get the blessing me. You get all of it. And that was good news for the people in the story. It was good news for the exiled community of the 6th century who received the story. And it's also good news for us in 2023. My friends, a complaint is not necessarily a sign of a lack of faith. A complaint can be the beginning of change for the better. Because, you know, our loving, compassionate pragmatist that we call God can handle all of it. Thank you for listening.